This is the Revolutionary Radio, run by none other than the most runaway slave called Gillie Pries, in association with the World Wide Web, this control, even the ebb that flows in the sea. Revolutionary Radio, Gillie, live free.
Yeah, welcome to Revolutionary Radio, and I'm Gillie Pries. Today I'm going to address a very important topic, and what it covers is what can an individual be outside of themselves? Is there any form of true existence outside of a people's or an individual's true nature? I once read a legal case. This is a case from the 18th century. I don't recall the name of the case in the United States, but the case was dealing with how the German people saw themselves during the 18th century and how they basically see themselves today. And according to the German people, they expresses a philosophy in this particular legal case that borders on the philosophy and doctrine that was produced by one of the greatest German philosophers, greatest in the sense of to the German and European people. And some of you may be familiar with his name. His name is Friedrich Nietzsche. And basically what Friedrich Nietzsche says is this: that nations and people and individuals, if they are basically left to their own proclivity, and he was speaking in reference to most of the leaders, if a leader is left to his own proclivity, he can do nothing wrong. This Nietzschean philosophy was what Adolf Hitler bought into and created the philosophical concept of the Führer, the leader of Germany, who should have unlimited power, unlimited access, and he would be able to do nothing but good. Now we all see what came out of Hitler's philosophy as he applied Friedrich Nietzsche's teachings. World War II came out of that, and close to 100 million people died behind that philosophy. This Nietzschean philosophy is basically this: the German people are the highest evolving cultural people on the face of the earth. They have been through an evolution that is the highest form of human expression. All other cultural development is seen as inferior to the German people. And in a broader sense, all racial and cultural development throughout the earth is inferior to the European cultural expression. And this cultural expression of the European people is seen not only as the most superior, not only as the most cultural development, but it is a cultural expression to which the entire world should bow. The international laws, the creation of the League of Nations in the 20s, the creation of the United Nations coming out of World War II, all these laws that govern international conduct is nothing but an expression of the enforcement of the Germanic / European way of interpreting the world upon the rest of the world and its people. Now, if you want to look at it in a more practical sense, let's look at it this way. When the League of Nations came into existence, I think somewhere after World War One, right? World War One in about 1917, so we can figure the League of Nations came about maybe 1920. The United Nations came after the end of World War II. So we could say 47, 48 or somewhere around about there. At that time, European nations, with the exception of Ethiopia, were the only free nation on the face of the earth. The Indians were under colonialism. China was occupied. South America was colonialized. The Caribbean was colonialized. The only free people on the face of the earth, excluding the Ethiopians, were the Europeans. Now, what is fundamental about that? To this reasoning, because it was during that time international laws were written. So the world today is engulfed within international institutions and international laws to which the vast majority of the human beings on the face of the earth had no say. Technically, then, international law is nothing more than European law to which the world must bow. So when we get back to the Nietzschean philosophy, that the European culture and norm and institution are the most superior to the world, and the fact that it is seen that those institutions develop out of the natural proclivity of Europeans, and from that proclivity you get the most efficient political and economic system, and that is the system to which the rest of the world must bow. So therefore, what is seen as natural to the Europeans, other people must adapt, even though it may not be natural to them. So if we find ourselves being forced to function in a world where those who impose international law, those laws are natural to them, but we who are expected to adapt it, to whom it is unnatural, whom do you think will be better able to function within that system? The people that those laws are natural to, or the people who finds those laws cumbersome and unnatural? You apply the answer to that. So when you delve into the case that I'm speaking about, all of the institutions in the world, economically, politically, culturally, morally, ethically, any philosophical aspect of the Western civilization, even of the concept of God, the world is expected to bow to that form of philosophy. And they apply morally, ethically, any philosophical aspect of the Western civilization, even of the concept of God. The world is expected to bow to that form of philosophy. And they apply active terms to those. They apply responsible government. If you don't adhere to their form of government, they label you're not of a responsible government. You do not believe in reasoning. You do not believe in freedom and liberty. These are concepts that evolved out of Europe at a time when Europe was conquering the world. So when you speak of freedom, and the European institutions speak of freedom, we are speaking of two different concepts of freedom. For the Europeans, liberty and freedom simply means one thing: their liberty and freedom to subjugate the rest of the world. That is what freedom means to them. It does not mean the terms that you try to apply to it. Oh, I'm free to live where I want to live. I'm free to eat what I want to eat. I'm free to do what I want to do. That is not what the freedom that the United Nations, NATO, and all those other European institutions, the World Health Association, that is not their meaning. Now, let's look at it deeper so that you don't believe that I'm misconstruing what Europeans and European institutions mean by meaning. Let's go back to the European Renaissance of the 16th century. Europe was just coming out of what they call the Dark Ages. That was prior to the time when the churches were ruling, when the churches were government. At one time in Europe, the Catholic Church was the church that ruled Europe. Later, through dissensions, through Martin Luther and challenges to the church's selling Pries, other Protestant denominations evolved. But let's look at what came out of the Dark Ages. Out of the Dark Ages, you have the intellectuals started to develop in Europe. And they came up with the concept of the Renaissance, when we shall no longer be governed by theological doctrines, but by the reason of man. When science were being developed, when scientific hypothesis became preeminent over scriptural doctrines. It was during this time they say all men were created equal. It was during this time they say man should have the liberty to determine his own destiny. It was at this time mercantilism take over, where they say free trade. Now the term free trade is a funny concept within this Renaissance doctrine. I'm going to touch upon the free trade because throughout the Caribbean and African philosophical system, we have this concept of free trade, and we know not where free trade come from. So I'm going to tell you where free trade come from within the context of the European Renaissance that has imposed these wide libertarian doctrine upon the rest of the world, to which they have their own meaning and concept, and we have been bamboozled by an assumed meaning and concept. The church during the conquering, when Europe was conquering the West, the church divided, created a line right down the Atlantic Ocean and gave one side to the Portuguese and gave the other side to the Spanish. He said anything on the right of that line going from the middle of the Atlantic Ocean towards Africa was for the Portuguese, and anything on that dividing line going to the left were for the Spaniard. That's one of the reasons where you found like Angola and Mozambique to the right of the line were conquered by the Portuguese. And to the left of the line, you find the Spanish conquistador conquered all of South America. That's how the Spanish came in Jamaica before the British, because it was given to the Spaniard by the church. At that time, England, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, all in northern Europe, they had no right to trade and conquer lands in those regions. Only the Spaniard and the Portuguese were given that power by the church. Germany and England was not going to go for that. So Germany and England, and this was during the time when the trade slave was going, was almost at its height. At that time, it was trade slave was getting started and going. Germany, France, Northern Europe said no. Listen now, listen for the term. We have the right to also trade freely. The concept of the free trade came out of the concept of slavery, the right for the rest of the European nation to trade in slaves. Today we believe that when we buying and selling, that's what free trades mean. So when you tout in free trade and the superiority of free trade and how this world could not do without free trade, you cannot neglect the concept of where free trade come from. It was to trade in the blood and flesh of your own ancestors. That's what free trade means. So let's go back to the Renaissance now. During this period of the Renaissance, when reasoning was supposed to supersede over the doctrine of the churches, because the church, which is a Catholic church, when they use the term the church, at one time in Europe, it meant the Catholic Church because there were no other churches. The church, the Catholic Church, began to lose legitimacy. And this is where Martin Luther came up and he nailed his 100 grievances and and protested. The term Protestant comes from the word to protest. That original protest was a protest against the corruption of the Catholic Church. So intellectuals started to evolve in Europe, and they came forth with the doctrine that reason, scientific research, hypothetical analysis, art, culture, food, all these different things started to take off in Europe, and under one caption it became classified as during the Renaissance. And this is what they teach you in school. Professor stepped to the fore and said, we're going to study today, and we're going to learn, and we're going to read about the Renaissance and the benefit of the Renaissance of liberty and justice and the equality of man, the right to religion. This is what they propagate, theoretically and academically. But what did the Renaissance, what did the European Renaissance, what did Europe brought us when they came out of so-called darkness and into the light with the power of reasoning, with mind over matter? It brought us into despair and degradation. All of the negativity that all the aboriginal people of this world, and the Africans, and the South Americans, and the Incans, and the Mayas, these were great people of empires in South America. The Renaissance created nothing but death and destruction throughout the face of the earth. That's what the Renaissance brought non-European people. But they never teach you that in school. They teach you that the Renaissance brought you art, it brought you culture, it brought you reasoning, it brought you great academic institution, it brought you liberty, it brought you justice, it brought you equality, it brought you all these things. Only it did bring those things for Europeans. So what that is telling us, when Europeans use those terms do not include the non-Europeans on the face of the earth. When America sends its emissary to Jamaica and say you need to open up the country and create liberty, they only mean you need to open up the country so they can come and suck the blood and the life out of the people. It means nothing more. It does not mean what you believe it means. It has nothing to do with a poor man opening up a shop and being able to trade freely. It means to subjugate the entire nation to the will of a European philosophical concept that say they have a right to subjugate you. Now, for those who maybe what I said didn't compute fast enough, I'm going to give you another example. Let's go back to the creation of the United States Constitution. When Thomas Jefferson and his cohort wrote the U.S. Constitution, the preamble of the Constitution says, all men are created equal. At the very moment he wrote those concepts, Thomas Jefferson owned a slave plantation. Every single member of the authors who wrote that Constitution were slaveholders. So what did they actually mean when they say all men are created equal, endowed with the right to pursue happiness and liberty, blah, 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 blah? And at the same time, they had over 4 million people in bondage. How could you turn around and assume that when they used those words, you were included? You were seen as a human being. Those words were meant for you. Think about that. Well, that example goes back to the concept of the 16th century Renaissance, when these highfalutin terms of liberty and justice came out. It meant that European nations, the single nations, each single nation should have the right of liberty to rape, murder, and plunder on an equal basis with any other nation, and in particular with the Portuguese and the Spaniards. So that is the philosophy we are encasting. So back again to the Renaissance. These Germanic people, to be specific, and the European nations and people in general Whether you want to believe it or not, they see it as their birthright to subjugate you. They see it as their birthright to subjugate any nation and people on the face of the earth, because they see it as their natural proclivity. When you study the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, he said any human being, individually or collectively, if he is subdued, then the strong has the right to subdue him. He even went further and said, when he started to question the doctrine of Judaism and the doctrine of Christianity, he said those doctrines are the doctrines of those who have failed, of those who are inferior. Religiosity is nothing but the expression of the inferior people on the race of the earth. Meaning, the more religious you are, it is an expression of more how inferior you are. And to show your ineptitude, to demonstrate your lack of ability, to demonstrate your inferiority, the same very thing that the strong does to the poor goes to church every Sunday and asks God to inflict those very things upon the strong and the rich. He explains the entire doctrine. The Friedrich Nietzschean doctrine has never left this face of the earth, or left the philosophical tomb of European concept. These great so-called institutions, these world international laws which presently governs us today, are nothing but implement and instruments of European so-called superiority on the face of the earth. Now let me get back specifically now to Jamaica within this Renaissance doctrine. Can a man, this is my question, can an individual exist outside of who is literally meant to be? Can a Jamaican become a European more than a European? Can a Jamaican use the European system as efficiently as the European who created it? So let's go back now. Let's say a man get up one day and say he's a dog. He wants to be like a dog. So he barks like a dog, he struts around on all four like a dog, he eats with his mouth in the bowl, he does everything. And then one day, after believing that he's a dog, he actually encounters a dog like a dog, he eats with his mouth in the bowl, he does everything. And then one day, after believing that he's a dog, he actually encounters a dog. And the dogs look at him. What do you believe that dog, the real dog, is thinking about this human being that is playing a dog? That real dog, if he could speak, he would say, what a clown. How could he actually believe that he's a dog? That same concept applies to when we of the African race believe that we even stand the slightest chance of becoming a European and to be successful within a European concept and philosophy of life and to evolve above the European. That is a fallacy of thinking. You can never ever be more European than the European. Stop chasing after your tail. So they have constructed a world in which they have applied what they call the common law of their ways, the laws that evolve out of the common way of interaction, and they have imposed that upon the world and then legislated those common laws, and today they call it judicial law. So for example, say in Europe they had common laws from the feudal time that say this is how by ancient days and practice, this is how we govern land. This is the way, or whenever someone does something that displeases about, this is how we satisfy or rectify that issue. When there were no written laws, they years later took those unwritten laws and codified them. And after they codified those unwritten laws, they traveled the world, conquer the world and impose laws that were once unwritten as written law upon the people they conquered. That is the law out of which the laws and constitution of Jamaica evolved. And if you read the Jamaican Constitution, when it was promulgated in 1959 by the British Privy Council, it basically said, all laws that are written in this Constitution, should it conflict with any law before it, any colonial laws before it, the colonial law take precedent. That means the colonial law stands over the new Constitution of the country. Get the Constitution and read it. It's right in the Constitution. It's in the preamble of the Constitution. There are sets of law that were attached to the Constitution that has nothing to do with the Constitution, other than the fact that it was attached to it in order to preserve the colonial system. So those laws that were attached to the Constitution came into effect 4 days before the Constitution came into effect. A lot of you didn't know that. We all believe that that package came in effect on the night of August 6, 1962. Now, the beginning of the Constitution, so-called independent Constitution, did not start on August 6. It starts somewhere around August 1st, August 2nd. The Constitution and law slowly began to come into effect. That was when they legalized the colonial members of parliament so they could actually be members in parliament on the 6th and after. Any other legitimate constitution, you would have to abolish all the members of parliament, call an election, call a referendum, and elect new members to take the seat on August 6, 1962. That didn't happen in Jamaica. All of the old colonial members of parliament, their position were legitimized either on the 1st or the 2nd of August. Not by a vote of the people, but by those who elected themselves as constitutional officers who went to England and negotiated with the British. And then we have the nerves to talk about we gained independence August 6, 1962. When you enacted laws from the 1st and the 2nd of August that preserved the colonial system. So when the Constitution came in effect on the 6th, that Constitution was technically null and void because it had no effect over the prior colonial laws. Those laws and constitutional declarations still governs us today in Jamaica. The Senate of Jamaica and the House of Parliament in Jamaica is nothing but a cocoon of colonial thinkers, men and women who lack initiatives, people who try to amend here and amend there while trying to preserve the old colonial system, a colonial system that evolved out of the common laws of Europe, and where those common laws came out of the concept of how Europeans naturally governed themselves during the times of unwritten laws. So what about we the Africans with our unwritten laws? Why haven't our unwritten laws today become legislative law in Jamaica to govern us? Why hasn't the way we learn to deal with other and settle dispute amongst ourselves naturally has not been integrated into how we judicially solve our problems? So at this moment, in 2024, any European can come to Jamaica, and based upon the fact that the laws in Jamaica is embedded in the common laws of Europe, he can find those laws more efficient to the way he lives, rather than how we Jamaicans find those laws so cumbersome and oppressive. It is because those laws are not natural to us. Today we are discussing the evolution of a new constitution, getting rid of the Queen and the Privy Council and the King, and create our own presidency. That's the issue I'm going to address sometime in the future. And I'm going to take a public position on that constitution, or the pending reassessment of the present constitution, to try and evolve a new constitution. Because we are not going to sit back and watch the same old game played again that was played in 1959. Where self-appointed people take it upon themselves to exclude the vast majority of this country and then come with a constitution and impose it on us. Any illegitimate constitution that is tried to be enforced upon us, we are going to resist it. We are going to resist it. We shall no longer abide by any constitutional laws from which we have been excluded. This is Revolutionary Radio. Until next time, this is Gillie Pries. Thank you very much.